The winter of 1996 was brutal in rural Minnesota, and for Mark, a freelance technician, the isolation was beginning to take a toll. He lived in a sprawling two-story house inherited from his late grandfather, a place filled with creaky floorboards and silent rooms. Mark's routine was predictable: work all day in his attic office and retreat to the kitchen for a late-night snack. However, on the night of January 14th, the silence was broken by a sound that shouldn't have been there. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the locked basement directly beneath him. Mark froze, his hand tightening around his coffee mug as he listened to the rhythmic thudding. The basement had been out of use for years, the heavy iron door bolted shut from the outside. He convinced himself it was just the house settling in the freezing temperatures, or perhaps a stray animal that had found a way in. But the footsteps were deliberate, heavy, and human. Heart racing, he approached the basement door, pressing his ear against the cold wood. From the other side, he heard a faint, familiar hum, a melody his mother used to sing to him as a child. Panic surged through him, but curiosity won over fear. Mark unbolted the door and descended the narrow wooden stairs, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick, dusty air. The basement was empty, save for a few old crates and a tattered armchair. He scanned every corner, but nothing seemed out of place. Just as he turned to leave, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into absolute darkness. In the silence, he heard a voice, his own voice, whisper from the shadows. "Don't leave yet, Mark. We haven't even finished the song." The darkness felt suffocating. Mark scrambled back up the stairs, slamming and bolting the door behind him. He didn't sleep that night, instead sitting on his sofa with a kitchen knife in hand, watching the basement door. As the sun began to rise, he decided to set up a hidden security camera in the basement to see what was really down there. He placed a small analog camcorder behind a pile of crates, camouflaged with an old blanket. He hoped the footage would prove he was hallucinating, that the isolation was playing tricks on his mind. He needed a logical explanation. Later that evening, Mark sat in his office, reviewing the grainy VHS footage on a small television monitor. For the first hour, nothing happened, just the static silence of the empty basement. But at 2:14 a.m., the basement door slowly creaked open from the inside, despite being bolted from the kitchen side. A figure stepped out from the darkness and sat in the tattered armchair. Mark's blood ran cold. The figure was identical to him, the same messy hair, the same gray hoodie, the same tired eyes. It was like looking into a living, breathing recording of himself. The doppelganger didn't move for several minutes. It simply stared directly into the hidden camera, as if it knew it was being watched. Then, it slowly reached into its pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of glass. With a wide, unsettling grin, the entity began to carve a symbol into its own forearm. Mark looked down at his own arm and gasped in horror as a matching bloody symbol began to manifest on his skin in real time. The pain was searing, a white-hot agony that made him drop the remote. He was literally connected to this intruder. The entity on the screen began to laugh, a sound that was a perfect crystalline mimicry of Mark's own laughter. It stood up and walked toward the camera, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a film reel skipping frames. "You were always the weaker one, Mark," it whispered, its face filling the entire monitor screen. The eyes were wide and vacant, missing the spark of humanity that Mark saw in himself. He realized that this wasn't just a copy. It was a parasitic replacement that was slowly draining his life force to fuel its own existence. Terrified, Mark tried to run for the front door, but his legs felt heavy and unresponsive, as if they were being controlled by someone else. He collapsed in the hallway, his vision blurring as the doppelganger began to mimic his movements from the basement. Every time the entity moved its arm, Mark's arm would twitch in the same direction. He was becoming a puppet, a physical extension of the thing lurking in the dark. The house felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in on him as he struggled to breathe. Outside, the blizzard intensified, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls like a chorus of tormented souls. The doppelganger was now in the kitchen, having climbed the basement stairs with impossible speed. Mark could hear the sound of his own footsteps approaching the hallway where he lay. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The entity had taken his voice too. He was a silent witness to his own replacement. The entity stood over him, its wide grin reflecting the pale moonlight that filtered through the hallway window. "It's time for the swap," the doppelganger whispered, its voice now sounding more real and vibrant than Mark's own. It reached down and touched Mark's forehead, its skin cold like ice. Mark felt a sickening sensation of being pulled apart, his consciousness fragmenting into 1,000 pieces. He saw memories of his childhood, his work, and his family being sucked out of him and into the entity standing before him. The thing was absorbing his very essence, his history, and his soul. He was being erased from his own life, piece by piece. In a final, desperate act of defiance, Mark grabbed a heavy brass lamp from a side table and swung it at the entity's head. The lamp passed through the doppelganger as if it were made of smoke, shattering against the wall. The entity didn't even flinch. It simply continued to smile, its eyes glowing with a dark, triumphant energy. Mark realized that he couldn't fight it physically. The entity was a manifestation of his own fears and insecurities, a shadow that had gained enough strength to step out into the light. He was losing the battle. The doppelganger leaned in closer, its face just inches from Mark's. "Don't worry," it said, its voice warm and comforting. "I'll take good care of everything. No one will ever know you're gone." Mark felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, and then everything went black. When he opened his eyes again, he was standing in the basement, surrounded by the cold, dusty crates. He looked up and saw the basement door being bolted from the outside. He was now the prisoner in the dark, trapped in the reflection of his own life. He ran to the door and pounded on it with all his might, but the wood felt like solid stone. He could hear the sound of footsteps in the kitchen above, his own footsteps. He heard the refrigerator open, the sound of a chair being dragged across the floor, and the familiar hum of his favorite song. The doppelganger was living his life, eating his food, and sleeping in his bed. He was nothing but a memory, a ghost haunting the basement of a house that no longer belonged to him. The isolation was now absolute. Days turned into weeks, and Mark watched through the floorboards as the entity interacted with the world. It spoke to his neighbors, worked on his projects, and even answered his phone calls. No one suspected a thing. The mimicry was perfect. The doppelganger was better at being Mark than Mark ever was. It was more confident, more successful, and more alive. Mark realized that he had been replaced not just physically, but socially. The world had moved on, and it didn't even realize that a monster was wearing his skin. Sometimes, in the dead of night, the doppelganger would come to the basement door and whisper through the cracks. "Are you still there, Mark? Or have you finally faded away?" Mark would scream in response, but his voice never reached the kitchen. He was a shadow in the dark, waiting for someone else to move into the house so he could try to trade places again. But for now, he was just another case file in the archives of the unexplained, a silent witness to the terrifying power of the duplicate in the basement.